Hi, my name's Dr. Jane Garner. This is a recording of a presentation that I first gave at University College London in October 2024. I promised that I would make a recording of this presentation because I was unable to record it at the time. So the focus of this presentation is really the work I've been doing for the last few years, looking at applied research in relation to library and information studies and how libraries work with vulnerable populations. Uh, the focus of the talk has really looking at some of the projects that I've been working on over the last few years. One big thread of things that I work on is looking at libraries, information and reading and learning in prisons. And I've managed to do that study across a few different countries. So I'll be talking about that. I've also done a big study that looks at how public libraries can work with people experiencing homelessness and how that is currently working and what some of the issues are there and how we might be able to improve the way that libraries are supporting that group. And there's a sort of an offshoot of that project has sort of surfaced, which is looking at the effect on library workers on working with these really vulnerable communities. And I'm also developing an interest in looking at the idea of social prescribing and how libraries might play a role in that. So I'll explain what that is as well. Now, before I get any further, there are a couple of trigger warnings with this presentation. There will be images and discussions of prisons and prison conditions, particularly in the Philippines, which is not particularly nice to look at. And I'll also be talking about domestic violence and its consequences. So I will give you another warning as I get to those particular slides, but just getting you know that those things are part of my discussion today. So my work started in this area with my PhD study, which I completed in 2017. And I looked at the role of prison libraries in the lives of adult Australian prisoners. And I was interested in it from a phenomenological perspective because I wanted to get the views of the people themselves who were actually using the libraries and jails rather than sort of viewing it from the outside. I wanted to get their stories and allow their voices to be really present in the work that I was doing. So I completed that in 2017 at the Royal Melbourne Institute of Technology here in Melbourne, Australia. Um, this next few slides, I've got some pictures of some of the libraries in the jails that I spent some time in, just to show you what they look like, because it's not something that many people get to see. So yes, my research methodology was using a phenomenological approach, which is really just a way of saying that you're getting the perspective of the person who is experiencing the phenomenon. The phenomenon in this case is the use of a prison library. So it's really putting the experience, the lived experience of the people who are using the prison libraries right at the front and centre of the research and making sure that it's their voices that were being heard through the research rather than me sort of looking in as an external person and trying to understand what I was seeing. I was actually asking them to tell me and teach me about what they were experiencing. And that was a really lovely way to do the research to make sure that the vulnerable people that I was working with had a really strong influence on the outcome. So this is a library. The first picture was a library in a just going to jump back to it. That was a library in a men's prison in Western Australia. South Australia. That was a library that had a library worker in it who was also a prisoner, as is the case in pretty much all of our jail libraries. And this library was interesting because they wouldn't allow people to come in and use this library. This was only available, the books were available sort of by request. So it was no access to the space at all, which was sort of, removed some of the benefits of having a library there in the first place. But the collection was available, so that was a good thing. Now this one is a women's prison also in South Australia. This is it's in the protection section. So this is a section where women are kept away from the general population of women in the jail for their own protection for various reasons. And you can see the nice magazines and things there. It was actually quite a good collection. There was two ladies who ran this library, both prisoners again, and they were really, really proud of it. It was really nice to spend time with them and to have a look at the work that they'd done, keeping the collection and the space looking really nice. and they were very proud of their work there. This is another women's prison. This one's in Victoria, and this is the library space, which, as you can see through the door there, this was shared with the gym, so it was very much associated with sort of the recreation of the prison. It was a very loud space because the gym was loud and they had the radio going all the time, and it wasn't a very peaceful space. And again, the collection was pretty old and mostly built through donations, which is the case in Australia. There are generally no librarians in jail libraries here, and there are no attempts to build collections that actually meet the needs of the people who use them. They are generally built through donations and prisoners giving books that they might have got for Christmas. They might read it and then pop it in the library so other people can read it. But there's no one really looking after these libraries apart from the inmates themselves, and generally there's no budget to support them. This is another one. This is a men's prison in Victoria. This is the legal collection and some of the textbook collections there. So there's, again, not a great library, but the men who run this one, again, were trying really hard to make it as good as they could. They didn't have much room in this place, so you can see the books there are pretty much jammed in. So the results of my PhD was looking at the 5 main findings, really. We're looking at the different ways that the libraries were important to people living in the jails. So the first one there that was a place to escape to was very much based on the both the books, so like, when you read for escapism, so you could take yourself somewhere else in your head, which is obviously really valued by people who are stuck in cells. But it was also when they did have physical access to the spaces, they were able to come together and they found like-minded people. And that sort of relates to that third one there too, a place to find community, where people would come to the library because they were interested in reading, or they were interested in the newspaper, or they were keen to spend time with other people who were sort of at their same education levels. And the library was the only place really in the prison where you could come that was not a cell or like a shared cell space or one of the wings. So it was really, really valuable for that reason. Changing the experience of time was interesting. It was this, they were telling me about how they would use reading to shrink time. So they would say things like, I read my book and I'm sitting in there reading, I read all these pages, and then I look up and 2 hours have passed. And that's brilliant because I've actually filled that time and I haven't even noticed time passing because I've been so immersed in my book. And obviously they have a lot of time, and being able to fill it in a constructive way and to distract them from the passage of time was really highly valued. The self-responsibility was an interesting one. So this was relating to the fact that, when you go into jail, you get everything is done for you or decided for you. You get told when you can eat, what you can wear, who you can be with, who you can talk to, who you can't, when the lights are going to go off, when you have to be back in your room, when you can leave your room. All of this stuff is all taken away from you. All those choices are taken away. And they were saying the only place in the whole prison that they can come and make a choice for themselves was the library, because they could come in and they could choose what they would like to read. And they used that capacity to make choices was highly, highly valued. And one of the men said to me, one of the greatest dangers of coming to jail, it's not getting hurt or bashed or knifed, it's being institutionalized. It's having all those choices taken away from you, takes you to a place where you can no longer make decisions for yourself, and you become institutionalized and you become dependent on the other people doing stuff for you. He said the library is the only place that breaks that passage into institutionalization. So it was very highly valued for that. The last one there about opportunities to contribute to education. We think of libraries as places of knowledge and places that you can come to learn if you wish to, but in prisons, because there aren't any librarians, or there's very, very few, and the collections aren't built to meet the needs of the people who use them, there is no capacity for them to be used for education, or very, very weak links through to learning stuff. The interestingly, in Australia, the libraries that I went to, or the prisons that I've been to, there was no link between the education arm of the prison and the library. So the people who were doing the education stuff weren't using the library, and they also weren't part of looking after the libraries. And you can see that table there, how many these libraries sometimes belong, in that third column there, they sometimes belong to the education arm of the prison, but they don't use the library because they're just not built to support education. So there's a real a lost opportunity there. And you can also see there's, if I move my head, can I do that? Yes. There's not many librarians in our jails. Mostly it's run by the prisoners themselves who get a job working in the library, like they might get a job working in the laundry or the kitchen. Some of them get a job to work in the library, and they do their best to try and make these libraries as good as they can be. So I first gave this talk when I was in the UK, and I made the point that I had visited a couple of prisons um, in and just outside London, Wormwood Scrubs and Brixton. Since I gave this presentation the first time, I've also visited 3 prisons in Kent to the east of London, and looked at the libraries there. And it was really interesting that in Kent in particular, and I'm not too sure about Wormwood Scrubs and Brixton, but certainly the libraries I saw in Kent, in the prisons there, they were run by the local public library. So they were like considered a branch of the local public library. So they provided staff, and they provided collections, and they provided access to some of the programs that are run in any other branch were also being run in the prison branches. And the capacity for those libraries to meet the needs of the people who are needing to use them was so enhanced and so much better supported because they were just another public library branch. And I think it's a really, really good model that we don't have here in Australia, but it's an excellent opportunity and something I would love to see happen here. I've also travelled to the US and visited a children's prison. This was a children's prison in South Carolina, and this was the library. So this effectively acts as the school library because these are children. They all have to go to school, and they go to school within the jail. And this was the library that they were using. And this does have a librarian, and she was doing an excellent job keeping the collection as relevant as possible and working with the teaching staff. So there's a real lesson there about um, working holistically within the institution that she was in, recognising the educational role of her library and working with the education staff to work on student projects and to build collections that would help them learn. So that was a really great opportunity. From there, I was able to pull all these lovely authors together, and we produced a book called Exploring the Roles and Practices of Libraries and Prisons, International Perspectives. And you can see on that list on the right-hand side there, lots and lots of different perspectives. Different countries were writing in about libraries and jails in various ways. As I said, this was originally delivered in the UK, this presentation. So what I did was I highlighted the 2 chapters that had come from the UK. One from Jane Finlay, who's now working at the University of Sheffield and is an excellent contact if you're interested in prison libraries in the UK. Jessica Bates was her co-author, and Cheryl Canning and Steve Buchanan also doing some excellent work in the UK looking at prison libraries. So they're really good contacts if they're people you are interested in. Following on from that, I have also worked on writing standards and guidelines for libraries in prisons. So I wrote the Australian one there. The Australian Library and Information Association is like our umbrella professional organisation, and they publish standards and guidelines. So I wrote one for prisoners. And also I was part of a working group that introduced, well, that wrote this second one here, the IFLA guidelines. So that's the International Federation of Library Associations and Institutions. So that's sort of like the umbrella group that sits on top of all the national library and information associations across the world. IFLA runs them as at the sort of the top international level. With that group, we got together and we wrote these guidelines. This was the 4th edition, so there were existing editions, but they were quite out of date. So we put together a new one, and that was published February last year. So if you're interested in looking at what jail prison libraries should have in them, like how big they should be, what their collections should include, how they should be staffed, how the physical space should be set up, how to integrate information technology, all sorts of different programming ideas for different cohorts. Have a look at those IFLA guidelines. They're available for free online, obviously, and there's all sorts of really good information in there, and a really good sort of introductory section as well that talks about the role of libraries in jails, which is good to have a look at. Additional work that I've been doing looking at libraries and information in prisons, I completed a study in New South Wales here in Australia, where I was interested in the information seeking practices of people living in prison, because I've been and I've looked at all these libraries, right? I thought these libraries aren't very good, and I'm wondering how well they're actually meeting the information needs of the people that they're meant to be serving. So I did this really quite big study. I went to 6 prisons. I surveyed all of their the inmates and talked to them and asked then in the survey about their information needs and practices across those 6 domains there. And then I got the survey results back, and then I went into each of those jails and I sat down with a number of people, men and women, over a few days, and I interviewed them about their information practices, just to sort of follow up what I'd learnt from the survey to get some more in-depth and more, rich information about that. So the results of that study came out in a paper in the Journal of Librarianship and Information Science, and these were the findings. So basically there were huge amounts of unmet need. Because the libraries aren't built to meet the needs of the people who are using them, there are huge gaps in the information that people need across all of those 6 domains and what they're actually able to achieve. So a lot of unmet need. This has a significant impact on people both inside the jail and on outside when they're trying to reintegrate back into the community, and also the frustration that's felt by their families that they can't get information to their people that they're associated with in the prison. The differences in gender was an interesting one. The level of unmet need was much greater for women than it was for men. From the survey, I noticed this. So I explored this some more when I went in to talk to the people who are living in the jails. Why might this be? And it turns out that the men who are imprisoned tend to have a woman on the outside. So their wife or their girlfriend, often, or usually, um, who is able to help them. So they might ring them up and say, look, I really need to know something about X. And that woman would then send the information in. They might look it up on the internet, print something out and post it back in. Whereas women who were in prison were much less likely to have a support network on the outside, so a husband or a boyfriend or anyone else. So when men come into jail, their women stick around. When women come into jail, their men tend to leave. So the differences in gender was quite marked. The weak role of libraries was not surprising. As I said, the libraries aren't built to meet the needs of the people who are using them. So as an information resource, the libraries were very, very poor. And the results of all this lack of information or lack of ability to meet their information needs is a really strong reliance on non-expert sources. So you've got people in prison asking each other about medical conditions or about housing on the outside, or they're talking to custodial staff about how to get access to their children when they're released from prison. So really inexpert sources of advice are being queried, leading to the possibility of a lot of misinformation and disinformation and inability to meet those information needs. So that was an interesting study that really just points to we need to do better with our prison libraries and get them to actually be useful information resources. Extra work that I've done looking at prison libraries. This one I was working with the theory. This is Elfreda Chapman's theory about small world information seeking and about life in the round and about information poverty. Her theory was that people who live in these sort of small closed communities such as prisons don't look outside their prison walls for information. They find what they need within the prison, and they satisfy themselves with building their own networks of knowledge. Anyway, that was completely different to what I kept being told by people who were living in the jails. So I thought, okay, I'm going to go back and look at her theory, which she built by working with people who are living in jail. And I said, I'm going to apply her existing theory to my modern prison data and see if I can work out whether her theory still stands up against modern data. And I don't think it does. So my argument about why that theory needs to be revised or questioned is in that particular paper there that you can track down if you want uh, in that article, the Journal of Documentation. So you can track that down if you want to read about that. Now, first trigger warning. I'm about to show you a picture of jail in the Philippines. This relates to some work that I've been doing with the United Nations in putting some libraries into jails there. So these are quite hard to look at. So if you don't want to see this, then now's a good time to look away. Okay, here we go. All right, so these are the conditions that people are living in jails in the Philippines. Here comes another one. And as you can see, there's no cells or rooms or running water or anything like that. Everyone just lives sort of out in the open in various spots on the ground. Now, there's a huge amount of overcrowding in the prisons there, as you can see, and the United Nations were aware of the conditions here and wanting to do something about it. There's a provision within the justice system in the Philippines that prisoners can get a reduction in their sentences by reading or by going to classes or by mentoring others. So the United Nations said, okay, that's great. Let's get these guys reading books, and they can then reduce their sentences, improve their literacy levels, and improve their outcomes for the future. Problem was that there were no books in the jails. There were no libraries in the jails, so no one was able to take advantage of this particular provision. So they said, okay, let's put some libraries in the jails. Let's see how we can make that happen. And they called on me and a bunch of other people who are experts in putting libraries into jails or how libraries in jails can work. And they ran a program called the Read Your Way Out program. Pardon me. And this is us. We all went to Manila for a week, and we talked to prisoners, and we talked to custodial staff who you can see here, and we looked at what a library can look like in a prison, how it might operate in the conditions that they're working with, and working a pathway towards getting some libraries into the jails there. We also launched the international guidelines that I mentioned before, looking at how a library could look and how it should look and what we can do to make it work in prisons. So that was a fantastic opportunity. It was amazing to be able to go and help something so sort of practical and use my research in a really really effective way that actually helps people very directly. We've now got 13 prisons that have libraries in them for the first time in the Philippines, and the people who are living there are now able to get some reductions on their sentences by reading the books and getting home to their families quicker. So that was a really lovely project I got to do. The last thing I'll say about prison libraries is what I'm working on now. I'll be going back to the Philippines early next year. The program's been in place now for over a year. So now I'm going to go back and start doing some evaluation of it and say, okay, well, what's working, what's not working? How do we improve things? What can one library learn, or one prison learn from another? And doing some evaluation of how effective the libraries are in actually getting people out of the jail a bit quicker and moving through that overcrowding a bit. I'm also working with UNESCO in Hamburg, which is what this beautiful picture is of. UNESCO, we've got a contact there, and she and I are working on building a community of practice for prison librarians. It's a highly isolating job because you're locked into your workplace, and often people who are employed by prisons to be the library worker has no contact with other library workers in working in prisons. So there's no capacity for sort of, learning from each other or communicating with each other about what they're doing and trying out ideas and sort of professional development and community building stuff. So we're putting an online community of practice together with some training resources and some ways of connecting each other. And I'm working on another study with a group of colleagues, and we're looking at the role of custodial staff attitudes to prisoner learning and how well they're able to support prisoners to do that. That came from the fact that in the Philippines, when I was studying there, when I was working there, even though we were putting these libraries into the jails, right, and I was saying to the staff, is this just going to be like extra work for you? Is this going to be really hard? Something you're going to end up resenting because all of a sudden you have to do this extra work now? And they were all saying, no, no, we totally understand it. We understand the importance of learning. We know its value. We really want these libraries for our people because they will benefit from it. So they sort of understood, right? Which was a completely different attitude to what I've seen elsewhere, particularly in Australia, where the custodial staff don't always understand the value of learning and reading for inmates. And it turns out that the custodial staff in the Philippines all have an undergraduate degree before they become prison staff. So they have a much higher education level than the custodial staff in Australia, for example. And I wanted to see whether I could map that relationship between the custodial staff's educational experiences and their attitudes to prisoner learning. And if I can demonstrate that the more educated the prison staff are, the better supported prisoner learning will be, then that has implications on how we recruit and train our custodial staff to make sure we're getting a cohort in our jails that can actually benefit prisoners in their own learning. So that's a project I'm working on at the moment. Okay, now moving away from prisons, looking at another vulnerable community. I also work with people experiencing homelessness and looking at how public libraries can support that group better. So I've been funded by the Australian government to do a big 3-year project, which is coming to an end around about the end of the first quarter of next year, 2025. This project is looking at how public libraries can support people experiencing homelessness. And I'm interested in what they're currently doing and what the sort of the enablers and the barriers are to that relationship between homeless people and our public libraries. So I started off with a big survey of Australian public library workers, looking at their attitudes and experiences of working with people who are experiencing homelessness. And I'll talk about that in a minute. Then I've done 6 case studies where I've looked at 2 city libraries, 2 regional libraries, and 2 remote libraries. For each of those communities, I've talked to the people who are experiencing homelessness, so the homeless community themselves. I've talked to the public library staff in the area. I've talked to other library users who also use the library spaces, and I've talked to some of the social service providers who are working with that homeless community to try and understand that sort of 360 view of that relationship between people experiencing homelessness and other sort of outcomes of poverty and vulnerability and the library, and what that's like for each of those groups. So the first big thing I did was that survey of public library workers, looking at their attitudes and experiences of working with this community. I'm not going to go through all the data that came out of that, but I'll show you a way to find out more if you want to. But just a couple of things I wanted to highlight. I asked, how often are you aware that you've got people in your library who you think are probably homeless? And you can see like 43% were saying it's a daily thing. I see people. And the next slide indicates that most libraries are seeing like 2 to 3 or sort of up to 5 people a day. So it's a really common thing for a library staff member to look up and see someone they think, oh, I think you're probably homeless. Interestingly, though, only 7% of homelessness is rough sleepers. So 93% of people without homes don't necessarily appear to be homeless. So if we've got large numbers of libraries seeing people every day that they think are probably homeless, there's probably a whole lot more. There's like 93% of more people in the building who are also experiencing homelessness but don't appear to. So the thing to take away from that is that it's a common thing for people who are without homes to be in our public libraries. And this was across the whole country. It wasn't just a city, or it was, right from remote right through to all our city libraries as well. I asked if these libraries, I said, does your library have a policy that helps guide your work with this community? And most people said no, or they're not sure. And if you're not sure, well, that's pretty much no, because if you don't know if it's there, then you can't be guided by it. So very, very few libraries actually have a policy that helps guide their staff on how to work with this community as well as they can. I also asked, have you ever felt a person you think might be homeless has a negative influence on other library users? And nearly 70% of libraries said yes. I've been worried about this. This is a thing that I've noticed. I worry that someone who's homeless is coming in and is disturbing my other users. And I also asked, have you ever felt unsafe at work because of the behaviour of someone you think may be experiencing homelessness? And about 45% or 46% of library workers said, yes, I have felt unsafe at work because of someone I think might be homeless. And again, if you apply that statistic, that only 7% of homeless people are sort of visibly homeless in that they've been experiencing rough sleeping, there's a whole lot of other people. If I had asked that question differently about, have you ever felt unsafe at work because of the behaviour of someone who else is in the building, it's very likely that would have been much, much higher. And it's not a homelessness issue necessarily. It's a public service issue. And I'll talk some more about that, about safety in the workplace. I also asked people to strongly disagree, have a neutral response, agree or strongly agree to the statement, it's part of my job at the library to provide social services to people experiencing homelessness. And if you notice the wording there, I'm not talking about library services, I'm talking about social services. And if you stick the orange onto the end of the blue, the light blue there, you'll get the agree and strongly agree. And that will be taking you through to like 60% of library workers believe library work involves a social service to people experiencing homelessness, which I thought was really interesting. So we're seeing ourselves as a social service provider, not just a library service provider. So it's something to do where there's a story there about why library workers do what they do, or what role they believe they play in the lives of people that they work with. So if you're interested in more information about that survey, I published a paper about it in the Journal of Library Administration in 2023, and that breaks down that survey into much more information, much more detail. And also I followed up with interviews at 6 libraries, as I said, 2 city, 2 regional, 2 remote. And that article reports on those experiences and what I was hearing. I also wrote a paper that looked at how libraries are building partnerships with external organisations and groups to support vulnerable users. Because one of the questions I asked in that survey was, do you have any partnerships with other groups outside the library to support vulnerable users? And then I did a breakdown of what I'd been told. So I was looking at the existing partnerships between public libraries in Australia and social service providers or community service providers in their areas to support vulnerable users. So if you're interested in that, that's in the Journal of the Australian Library and Information Association. And I also have recently published a paper that looks at the effect on library workers of working with the public, essentially. So the challenging behaviours that we're seeing in all public spheres, like, I don't know, it's like outside Australia so much, but here sometimes you'll see ads on the television that remind you to be respectful and kind to frontline workers like nurses or public transport staff or police. And but no one's mentioned libraries in any of that. But we in libraries, we're working with the same groups. We're a public service provider. We're at the front line of community issues. Everything that's going on outside in the community comes into the library because our doors are open and we like it that way. But the upshot of that is that our library workers are being exposed to a whole lot of really challenging behaviours and issues and circumstances that we're really not very well equipped to deal with at the moment. So this paper in Public Library Quarterly is looking at the stories I was being told about the toll that this sort of public service work is having on our library workers. So if you're interested in that, you can jump in to have a read of that one. Now, this is a topic that's been picked up by it's really common, not just Australian, it's not just an Australian issue, it's something that libraries across the world are experiencing because we are a public-facing organisation and our doors are open to everybody. And there are very, very few organisations that can say that they keep their doors open to everybody. In the US, this group here, Urban Libraries Unite, are a group of library workers who have come together and they've created this thing called the Urban Library Trauma Study. They did it in 2022, and this was based on surveys and focus groups talking to library staff about their experiences of workplace trauma and how their workplaces are dealing with that and helping them through those situations, and the impact on the individual of a poor response or an insufficient response from the library community or their workplace. They come up with this model called the library trauma cycle, where they're looking at the outside stressor is, the thing that happens to the person in the library. So it might be someone coming in and being aggressive, or it might be someone coming in and having a medical event in front of them, something that's happening that's causing them stress in the workplace. And then that professional and community response in the next part of the cycle is how their workplace and how their community and how their industry responds to that initial stress. And the effectiveness of that response has a direct impact on the next stage of the cycle, which is the internalization of that trauma. If we can get that professional community response right or better, then there'll be less internalization of trauma on the individual. And therefore, they'll be in a better situation to keep doing their work and keep being exposed to these outside stresses without having them being damaged or traumatized or weakened by those events. So that professional community response is really, really important. And it's not something we're doing well here in Australia. In fact, when I was talking to the staff in my study, where there's 6 libraries that I went to, 2 in the city, 2 in the regions, 2 in our remote areas, every single staff member, except for one, every single other staff member, when I said to them, have you had an experience where you've felt challenged by someone's behaviour? They would tell me these stories and they would cry. Every single one of them would end up crying because they had internalized that trauma and they had no way of dealing with it. And we don't have the capacity at the moment to help our library workers not internalize that stress. Not only did they cry, but then they apologized for crying, like it was their fault that they had had this response. It's not their fault. It's their fault of the industry and the workplace that we don't yet know how to help them deal with those traumatic experiences so that they don't internalize the trauma and carry it around under their skin, like our library workers are currently doing. So that's some work I would really like to do in the future, is to run this study again in Australia this time to see if what it looks like in an Australian context. I suspect it'll be very similar to the American one, but perhaps not. That's something I would like to be able to test. And then I would like to work with industry associations and libraries that are doing a good job on the professional community response to build some structures and guidelines and processes of best practice that we can put in place in libraries to help our library workers deal with these traumatic events that are inevitable and are increasing. As long as we keep our doors open to the public, this is going to be an issue. We need to learn how to manage it better. So that's something I would like to be working on in the future and plan to. I also am interested in looking at libraries as sites of social prescribing. Social prescribing is not something we do a lot of in Australia. It's quite a new idea. In the UK, it's a bit more common. In other places, I think Canada and so there's a couple of other places that sort of use this practice. The idea of social prescribing is where someone might go to a health practitioner, like an allied health person, a doctor or a nurse or a community health worker, and they might say to them, look, I'm feeling really low energy. I might be a bit depressed. I'm lonely. My husband died, or my children have grown up and moved out, or I've retired and I've no longer got social connections with anybody and a sense of purpose. And instead of prescribing drugs or pharmaceutical responses to those experiences or those feelings, social prescribing is where they go, okay, you need some people around you who understand you or are interested in the same things as you. You need your community, whether it's find people for you to build a community so that you can slot into, and you will have people around you, and you'll reduce your isolation and your loneliness. And public libraries are obviously the perfect place for that to do that, because we're already running programs. Like if you go into any public library or many public libraries, they'll see, there's knitting groups or there's reading clubs or there's new mothers groups, or there's social groups for kids who like to play Dungeons and Dragons or whatever it is. So we're already doing this sort of building of community in our public libraries, but we've not made that connection with the health care needs of people, mental health and physical health. We're not doing that well here in Australia, so I would like to investigate the role that public libraries could play in this practice of social prescribing, or at least building community rather than medicating people for things that really could be helped by just being with other people and doing things together. So that is really all I wanted to say about the work I've been doing. What I wanted to do next is to talk a little bit about why I do this work and why it's important to me. And this is a trigger warning for domestic violence and homelessness. This is a response that I'm going to read you a response that I was given to one of the surveys that I did when I was asking public library users what it's like for them sharing spaces with people experiencing homelessness. Because I was interested in their experiences, because the library staff were saying, yeah, I'm really worried that my users are being disturbed by people who I think are probably homeless coming into the library, and I'm worried that they're having a negative effect on my other users. And so one of the questions I asked the other users was, have you been disturbed by someone you think might be experiencing homelessness? And what are your experiences of sharing library spaces with that group? And I did that through a survey, which I had on an iPad. I walked around the library, gave the iPad to people and said, hey, I'm doing some research this week about public libraries and homelessness. Would you be able to answer a online survey for me? And they would answer some questions and tell me about their experiences and attitudes towards sharing spaces with people they think might be homeless. And this was one response that came in through that survey. And I remember the person who I think did this in response, because I couldn't see, it was all anonymous, but I think it was a particular woman who was there with her son. And anyway, this is the response that she gave. And this explains, this sort of epitomizes why I do this work and why it's important to me. So she said, I spent my childhood growing up in libraries, which kept me safe from my home life. Libraries should be a place to read, reflect, and take you away from the world, even for just a while. A place you can study, read something new, to feel safe and welcomed. I'm currently homeless due to domestic violence and have my 13-year-old son here with me. And he loves coming to the library, where he can forget, even for just that hour, about going back to sleep in the car tonight. He has this hour to go on Roblox and connect with his friends that he misses greatly. This is what the library means to me, that 1 hour where he can be a kid again and not feel judged by not having a home. A library is a safe place for everyone, as we never know another person's story, so we shouldn't judge who they are. Thank you for letting me share this. So that response really, I read that when I need to remind myself of what I'm doing and why it's important. So thank you very much for listening. I hope this has been interesting and helpful for you. If you are interested in anything I'm doing or want to talk to me or just share some ideas, I'll welcome that greatly. You can find me all over the place. I'm on LinkedIn, or you'll find me online at Charles Sturt University. So thank you very much for listening. I'll stop this recording now.